Okay, take it away.
So howdy folks, I'm Richard Flanagan and I'm here to talk about synesthesia. So first up, who am I and why does this matter? I'm a design-focused creative professional, which no, I'm not an influencer or a content creator. I have a real job. I have worked in the areas of graphic design, art direction, interaction design, game direction in video games. And most recently, I'm mostly a stay-at-home dad, but I consult in the area of strategic design thinking. It sounds made up because it mostly is. And I'm a non-expert, and on LinkedIn, the en vogue term is a specialized generalist. So that's what I am. What I'm not a scientist like him. I'm not an expert at all. And I've kind of summed up some of this based on lay explanations I found online. So I'm synthesizing something already synthesized. I will probably make a few mistakes. He can correct them. And I'm going to make a few correlations in this presentation that might be nonsense, but it's kind of how it works for me. Okay, yes, let's talk a bit more about synesthesia. What is it? A phenomenon in which a stimulation of one sensory cognitive pathway leads to involuntary experiences in a second or more sensory or cognitive pathway, kind of alluding to my title about being crossed wires. I'll go into some examples, but the people that experience this are called synesthetes. And the Greek roots are this idea of perceiving things together. I'm going to give you an example that's probably the most common. It is called grapheme color synesthesia. So if all of these letters were white on the screen here, people with grapheme color synesthesia would perceive certain letters as having colors. They might perceive S's as greens and 2's as this light yellow. They might, but that's how they perceive those letters. They see them with color, even though they would be, for everyone else, white on the screen. So here's some more examples, some interesting ones. So for these examples, I want you guys to try and project yourself into these synesthetes' minds, the way they might be going about living their lives and just in the world. So imagine you saw someone shaking their hands or shaking someone's hands 20 meters away. And the moment you saw those people shake hands, you would literally feel that handshaking. You wouldn't be imagining it. You wouldn't be kind of associating what that feels like. You would literally feel that handshake 20 meters away. And this is called mirror touch. Another example, let's say you bit into a juicy orange, that nice bright flavor. And as you do, you hear a flute. You hear a passage, a little arpeggio or a little trill of a flute as you bite into fruit. And that is called gustatory auditory. And that's pretty wild. And we often think about this sort of thing in the sort of 5 classic senses, but it can dip into other pathways, other cognitive modalities. So you have a good friend, good dude, solid dude. His name is Derek. And every time you perceive his name, something happens. You could remember his name. Someone could say his name. You could read his name. But as Derek's name passes through your mind, you smell bacon. It sounds absurd to have a luxury olfactory kind of output like this. I don't know. I think it probably makes Derek an even better friend. So I've only shown kind of a few examples, right? And most of the examples are one in, one out. There's some research that suggests it can be one in, several out. But the possibility space is enormous. Like, there's so many combinations that could happen. And largely, it lacks research, too, from my understanding. Maybe your professor will confirm or deny that. And these are just the 5 sort of conventional senses we think of. We have to keep in mind these sort of cognitive pathways as well, and even emotional ones. When I was doing research, I read about a particular type of synesthesia called misophonia. And it's a condition where a synesthete experiences extremely negative emotional and aggressive behavior as a result of certain sounds. So we all, know the idea of like the fingernails on the chalkboard. But if someone had such an extreme emotional reaction, that could lead to really negative things in our real life. So, we have jokes, or it's kind of interesting to imagine these things, but for some people it could be really affecting their lives and changing the way they can live their lives. So anyway, but enough about the sort of scientific aspects, which I may or may not be nailing correctly. We're here to talk about my weirdness, which is sound related. So let's dig in a bit. But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about projective versus associative synesthesia. So projective is when someone literally sees a color, hears something, tastes something, feels something. So they literally hear it. They literally see a color. It's not kind of in the periphery of their imagination. They actually experience these senses. Versus associative synesthesia, where someone might have an extremely powerful association with a piece of music, or they see a landscape and they make a connection to a taste or smell, you name it. Yeah. So here's my synesthesia story. So most synesthesia starts really early, from what I understand. Some of the thinking thinks that maybe it's a part of a learning mechanism. Imagine a child learning colors or numbers or letters and sort of making those sort of cross connections at that early age. It's possible some of my synesthesia started then. I grew up in a house full of music 24/7. There's always music playing. But I don't know, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But what really came into my synesthesia came into the forefront around probably the age of 12, or around puberty. And as we know in the superhero comics, that's when you get your superpowers. So I think it's irrefutable. But what was happening around here was 12-year-old me got my first Discman. So I'm exploring tons and tons of my own music. I'm listening to music. I'm starting to read music. I'm starting to play an instrument for the first time. And generally I have this, adolescent curiosity for the world, but I'm ravenous for this musical information and this musical knowledge. So I'm learning a lot. So what was I sensing? So like I said, I'm listening to tons of music. I am reading more music. I am playing more music. And what happens? I'm starting to see shapes, starting to see simple, abstract forms, often connected with the ebb and flow of music. Especially when there's percussive components. I even perceive a little bit of motion, but it's all very abstract. I don't know what this means, but I can kind of see it. It's hard to describe, but in order to see it, I had to almost squint with my mind's eye. So it wasn't like right in the forefront, but it was there. And if you can imagine kind of squinting to focus inside your mind, that's what I was experiencing. So, so an auditory visual form of synesthesia, and it was pretty subtle, and it had an abstract connection. So I'm going to go through this journey, and there seems to be a progression of my synesthesia. My synesthesia has evolved since this, but that's how I remember it from this era of my life. So I got a little bit older, and I was really getting deep into sound, a lot of curiosity. So I was into synthesizers, electronic music, probably around the age of 17. I start writing my own electronic music, and I develop a much deeper set of learning and knowledge about sound, exploring sort of the fundamental components of sound, the atomic building blocks from the bottom up, as opposed to top down, which is conventional music kind of education. So I'm learning at like the particle level, kind of self-taught. And one thing you interact a lot with when you're doing electronic music is waves. I didn't realize what I was seeing before, maybe, were these waves. So I was interacting a lot with waveforms. This helped reinforce this sort of visual pathway from sound, abstract sounds, not naturally occurring sounds, into abstract kind of visual stimulus. And the more kind of time I spent learning, it reinforced and became more bidirectional, to the point where if I would experience or see a wave form, as I often did, I was interacting with a lot of oscilloscopes, because I'm one of those nerds, I would start to hear the relevant sound that I had that initial association with. It isn't a feedback loop. I won't hear this, see this, hear this, see this. It's a one-way situation, but it started to become bidirectional and fairly equal weighted. And I think as a result of like a more robust internal vocabulary. So it was a stronger connection and a little bit less abstract and bidirectional, which was interesting. So in my 20s, I started studying visual design. I went to university. I became a graphic designer. I was doing all kinds of stuff that was reinforcing the kind of visual aspect of my learning. And that's kind of a big component of all this, is when I was learning new things. So I started noticing another kind of output. And this is where things started becoming more specific. I started to notice that this sort of feed that went from auditory to visual started to be reinforced in certain very specific contexts. So to the point where the output sound becomes much more precise. Let me play you how I hear this Mark Rothko painting. I synthesize something that is as close as I can kind of communicate how I see this. So let's see if it works. Right. So for certain textures and gradients or abstract shapes, again, in the abstract kind of space, I start to hear more precise sounds. I have an arrow kind of pointing back, saying that perhaps if I heard this sound, I could envision something vaguely like this, but it's smaller, so it's reduced. But it has to be something abstract. So whether if I look at a photograph or I look at this group of people, it's far too much information. Maybe I don't have to infer as much. I'm not sure. But I don't hear anything when I look at this. I can hear something when I look at this. And I start to hear things in the time domain. Things change over time as I scan through an image like this. I think there's also an argument to be made about all this training. As I reinforce my knowledge, I'm reinforcing maybe the synesthetic connections and vice versa. Maybe there's a bit of a snowball effect there. But anyway, so this is super strong and it's very precise, but it is more unidirectional. But despite these synesthesias, my strongest one is something a little bit different. And it's taste to sound. That example I gave earlier of the flute, that's pretty close to my lived reality. So strong flavors, whether they're spicy or bitter or sour, imagine like the tannins in a big wine, or a strong spirit, I hear things. I hear specific things. Everything else has been pretty abstract up until this point. Synthetic sounds, abstract shapes. But this is where I really, really hear things. It's more musical. It's more evocative. It can be anywhere from single instruments all the way to small ensembles, single notes, crescendos, chords, simple transitions, but no complex notation, like not entire passages or phrases. It's still relatively simple in that regard. What's really interesting, though, is it almost always includes some form of brass. I learned to play trombone first. So I'm wondering, again, maybe these correlations are nonsense. I'm wondering if those initial connections are related to the fact that I always hear brass. Here's some examples. They sound dramatic. It sounds like some Hans Zimmer nonsense, but yeah, this is what I hear when I taste extremely strong and powerful things. Not a joke. Yeah. Or particularly good whiskey. That right there. That's it. Yeah, safe bet. Also, little bonus fact, I'm a super taster. So again, I'm connecting dots that might be nonsense, but yeah, I have a weird gift. So this is the strongest and most precise connection I have in my synesthesia. And it all kinds of has come together as sort of kind of who I am and kind of shaped who I am, I guess you could say. It's effectively shaped a lot of my life pursuits. And like I said earlier, I think there's a possibility that not only has it shaped my life's pursuits, but my pursuits have also shaped and reinforced aspects of my synesthesia. It's definitely helped shape aspects of my career path. I know I said I'm a kind of a specialized generalist, which is true, but I think my synesthesia has sort of passively shaped a particular expertise that I've developed over the course of my creative career. My ability to design in the context of sound, whether it's visual, whether it's interactive, is very good, and it's one of the things I'm known for. And I never tried to be an expert in that. It just kind of happened, and all of this is kind of reinforcing the aspects of my creativity when it comes to sound and just exploring new ideas. And I think it's even kind of shaped who I am and the company I keep, and to a degree, how I'm probably even raising my kids with my partner. So it really is part of who I am. I feel lucky to have this weird minor superpower, even if every once in a while I'll taste something and it sounds real bad. That does occasionally happen. But yeah, I think I probably lucked out in the synesthesia department. So that's me. Any questions?